Honey, if God showed you literally everything in you that needed to change, it would crush you.
You've found Why We Are Christians. Welcome. My name is Katie Philpott. I am the interviewer today for the second half of our interview with Barb Lownsbury, with whom we are Skyping from Cincinnati, Ohio. Welcome back, Barb.
Thank you, Katie.
Well, we spent a wonderful time last time talking about your childhood in Ohio and your family and how you felt as a child and your experiences and what you first kind of got the wisps of what Christian means or who Jesus is, who God is, what is church, and we followed your life through your parents' divorce time when you were a child into a time kind of like a lot of us with the high school years being so traumatic. And then we followed you into college in Arizona, and that's where a big thing happened for you. And would you kind of catch us back up for what happened that changed your life when you went to Arizona State University?
Well, at Arizona State, I met a wonderful church family, and there was one woman in particular who kept reaching out to me over the entire academic year. And she was a trooper because I certainly did not make it easy. And but she kept trying and she kept trying and she kept trying. And I thank God every day she kept trying, because finally at the very end of the semester, after studying the Bible, I finally really realized what it meant to repent and walk with Jesus on a daily day and to daily basis, and leave behind that old life and start new in freedom.
And what was in the old life that you needed to give up?
Oh my goodness, what wasn't in the old life that I needed to give up?
Well, were you Miss Goody Two Shoes? were you a completely spotless person?
Way years past, yeah, no. So I was, in high school, well, just partying, drugs. By the time I got into college, it had morphed. I didn't do all those things per se in high school, but though I certainly had my moments. But by the time I was in college, it was partying, drugs, men, just wild living. I mean, wild living. I remember reading very specifically that scripture where it describes people in the last days. People will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boastful, proud, abusive, disobedient to their parent. I just read that list and I thought, that's me, and that's everybody I know.
No,
yeah.
Yeah.
So.
And so something happened at one point that changed everything, and that was you came to faith.
Yes.
And then everything started changing. And you said that you learned something about yourself from this woman. I thought it was so interesting when you said that you thought you could just change everything bad about yourself all at once. All God had to do was show it all to you now. So what did your friend tell you?
Well, she didn't laugh at me outright. God love her. She just smiled and she said, honey, if God showed you literally everything in you that needed to change, it would crush you. And it's funny, I've often thought back on that statement because of the things that would end up coming down the pike. And the truth is, if I had known everything I would go through, I probably would have committed Harry Carey at that point or something. She's right. It would have crushed me. Truer words were not spoken.
She was very intelligent and very savvy person
Very
to
wise.
tell you that. And she also must have been very perceptive about your need. We wish we had more people like that in our lives who can look at
Yeah.
us and not take it personally when we reject their indications of our need. So I thank God for that woman in your life. I thank God for the people who did that in my life. And so you told me in your bio form that right after you got out of college, you went into full-time ministry. What was that ministry? Tell us something about what that was.
Well, once I became a Christian, all I could imagine doing was serving God with everything I had. I just couldn't imagine a better way to spend my time or my life. So I devoured my Bible. I just, anyway, I fell in love with everything God had to say. So I was very active in my church. I led Bible studies, and then I'd start overseeing a couple Bible studies. And by the time I graduated, I had met who would become my husband at that point, my senior year of
Mm-hmm.
college. And we started co-leading a teen ministry together.
Oh, okay.
And then from there, we moved into, well, then we did get married. So they gave us sort of a marrieds group over here too, so that we would have married people in our life to help our marriage, right? And eventually we had college groups and singles, and eventually we
Oh,
started
boy.
leading a branch.
So now,
Like a
are you
branch.
still in Arizona or were you back in Ohio at that point?
I am in Arizona at this point still, although we would eventually, what we ended up really being known for eventually was being able to walk into situations with people who were struggling in their faith, churches that were
Mm-hmm.
struggling in their faith, or ministries that felt weakened and just depleted,
Mm-hmm.
and going in and building into them and encouraging them, giving them vision again. So we moved a lot. I think our first 10 years of marriage, we moved 11 times.
Oh.
Just, I know it was rough, but it was also wonderful. I got to live many places, meet just so many different people, and have so many incredible
Mm-hmm.
experiences. So I can't.
And you were having children at that time too?
I did once when my kids were little. It wasn't as big of a deal, but once they hit school age, once really they got to be, I think my oldest was about 4, and he had some
Mm.
speech delays and some learning issues that needed to be addressed. And at that point, I kind of said, we need to stay put. We've got to stay
Yes.
put. And
Yeah.
but that happened to be back in Arizona at that point. So
Was your husband also um, a Christian fairly new to that time period, or had he been a Christian for a while?
he was also converted as a college student.
Okay.
So we both
Mm-hmm.
were newer in our faith. We were very blessed and fortunate, though. The way the church was set up is you always had more mature couples who were
Mm-hmm.
mentoring you and helping
Mm-hmm.
you. So we never felt like we were just out there on our own. We always had people that we were under their umbrella that would help us, and we
Mm-hmm.
could go to for advice, for guidance. And in that regard, it was wonderful.
At some point, you went back to college for a master's degree. Was that, what
Yeah.
time frame was that in?
So we ended up, after about a decade of being in the full-time ministry, we ended up coming out of ministry for a whole host of reasons. And when we did, that's when we moved to Cincinnati. So
Okay.
I actually, when I had gone into the ministry, I had gotten my degree in history, but I had started out with education as
Mm-hmm.
my major. And so then I went back to school once we moved to Cincinnati and got my post back in education,
Mm-hmm.
and started teaching. And then after my divorce, then I got my master's degree in education,
Mm-hmm.
thinking I would go back into teaching. Now God would call me in a completely different direction,
Yes.
but
Okay, now you've just said that bugaboo word, divorce.
Yes.
It creeped out very suddenly just there. I don't want to press too hard. Tell us, uh, tell us what kind of, um, I guess what I'm going to get to is how did that divorce time lead to what you're now doing, which is another kind of ministry, and it's called the Dented Fender, and you're doing quite a lot of work with that, and I believe it comes out of your experience, not just growing up, and but that it's really how does one handle what life throws at you, even
Yeah.
though it looked like you had it all together.
Yeah, I think so if I was going to sum all of it up, I would say for us, ministry put a strain on our relationship that probably wasn't healthy. And so that's part of why we made a decision to get out of it.
Mm-hmm.
And that did buy us more time. Our marriage did well for a while. I always say of my marriage that we have more good years than we had bad, and I still feel that way. And we had three beautiful children, which I appreciate. But I also learned that you can't give away entire pieces of who you are to appease somebody else's vision
Mm-hmm.
of who you should be. Um, and I believe God hates divorce, but there are biblical reasons He gives us for divorce. And
Yes.
unfortunately, those were
Yeah.
things that occurred. So, but yeah, I never could have dreamed in a million years that we would end up there. I think
Mm-hmm.
in my mind, I had done everything I could to stack the deck in my favor, so to speak. I
Mm-hmm.
married a minister. I married somebody
Yeah.
who loved God. I mean, what's not going to work? It just, and there's
Yeah,
nothing wrong
well,
with that. And in general, those
yes.
things can and do work, right? But
Yes, we lead a divorce recovery workshop and have for decades, and
and I've been through
there's a
those.
lot
I've
of
really,
things that we assume when we get together in a marriage relationship that might have applied at the beginning, and then things change. And if
mhm,
you don't keep readapting to the changes, it
mhm.
it gets away from you.
It does.
And yeah. So tell
I
us how
think
you came out of that time and into a sense of more strength, or what you had to go through to get to a sense of strength. Because a lot of people are going to say, oh, look, she's beautiful, she's talented, she's intelligent, she had a good life, she could, it's easy for her to get back on track. Why, what happened to her that could possibly relate to me? It doesn't.
right. Well, a couple of things. First of all, my life was certainly not that easy. We did have more good years than bad, but I had many a night of walking through the neighborhood just crying out to God to somehow release me because it was so incredibly difficult and so incredibly hard. It was just so difficult. And I think I started really worshiping saving the marriage more than saving the relationship. If I had pushed harder into saving the relationship, we might have gotten divorced a lot sooner.
Oh.
Um, but we might have healed um, anyway. But it was really the aftermath of my divorce. I think when I
Mm-hmm.
went through that, you hope you can. I still count having to tell my children is probably the most difficult thing. Here we raised them to love God and um, that things work when you love God, and here we are getting a divorce. Everybody was
Mm-hmm.
shocked. But it was the aftermath. It was the child support that didn't come in.
Mm-hmm.
I had been a stay-at-home mom
Mm-hmm.
at that point, and I was working to finish my master's degree and working. I started out working part-time because that's what we had agreed on, and then that changed very quickly. So then I had to I started working at 3 jobs, plus finishing
Oh,
a master's degree, plus 3 kids in tow. And I had weeks where I thought, I don't even know how I'm going to
yeah.
have money to buy gas to get to work in order to make more money to even buy
Mm-hmm.
groceries to feed the kids. I mean, it was incredibly stressful and
Mm-hmm.
fractured. And then my kids went through their own tunnels of deep challenge. Their father married somebody very, very quickly,
Mm-hmm.
rebound within, I think, 3 months of our divorce being final.
Mm-hmm.
And that just, they were still reeling from the end of our 20 years together. It just was such a rough time financially, emotionally, and spiritually. I mean, I felt betrayed by God. Intellectually, I knew that wasn't right,
Mm-hmm.
but emotionally, I was like, wait a
Mm-hmm.
minute, God, I
Yeah.
did everything. I mean, everything I could possibly think of to save my marriage that I knew to do. I gave you everything. I did everything you said to do in dating, and I should have gotten this outcome. How did I get this outcome? And that was really where God showed up and um, broke what last remnants. I'm sure I'll always struggle with pride to some degree or another because I think we all do. But the last remnants that were there, God shattered. I ended up losing my house, was foreclosed on, ended up having to go through bankruptcy. Um, it was just the financial devastation
Mm-hmm.
and was astounding to me. And keep in mind, I'd never, even when my mom was a single mom, sure we struggled, but
Mm-hmm.
I'd never had to carry that kind of a weight or a load. And it was crippling. I had no idea
Mm-hmm.
some things how I was even going to get there. And of course, that was the beauty is I learned to cry out to
Mm-hmm.
God in a deeper way. And God and I were very tight walking into
Yeah.
this. I mean,
Very
I'd spent
tight.
many a night crying out to God, right? But
Now it's even
oh,
more. Yes.
we just went exponentially deep. And I just saw God show up
Mm-hmm.
and in a $500, an envelope of $500 given to me one night when I was just desperate and money just showed up. And I saw him steer my path in a different direction for my career, which ended up being a brilliant thing. It opened up my
Mm-hmm.
time. Eventually, he called me to do this ministry, which
Mm-hmm.
I never would have thought to do. And my kids are all doing well. My boys are
Oh,
doing well.
cool.
My oldest
Wonderful.
is, I mean, they're all doing well. And that is such a testimony to God
Uh-huh.
because we were all train wrecks.
Mm-hmm.
So,
So, walk us through then how you get to your ministry, which is the Dented Fender ministry, and what it is, and where you're at with it now, because we have a little over 9 minutes left, and that's a good amount of time to really explore quickly how you got there and then what it is that you're doing.
sure. So, I am a dented fender. I feel like we all start out life, brand shiny new and just like that shiny new car. And we're excited and we've got this idea of where our path's going to take us and how things are going to go.
Uh-huh.
And life has a way of coming in and just boom, rear
All of a
ending
sudden, a
you.
collision, yeah.
And we start to define ourselves more by the dents and the dinks
Mm-hmm.
instead of understanding, no, those things don't define us. What defines me is that I am a daughter of God. And so this deep rooted insecurity and scarcity mindset that there wasn't going to be enough and all of these things, God shows up in my life and he begins to heal. And so when he called me to this ministry, I was just in a season of deep gratitude for all he had rescued us from. And I mean, I could tell you so many powerful stories, but we don't have time.
Well,
But
you didn't tell us
I will
one.
say,
You can give us one story.
well, I will tell you how he called me to ministry then. So I was just sitting there in my chair in the morning spending time with God is my habit. And it felt like God showed up in the living room that morning. I've never had an experience quite like it
Mm-hmm.
before or since. I mean, I literally fell on the floor, prostate tears immediately coming because it was such an intense
Mm-hmm.
sensation. And I felt like he was calling me to share these deep and profound lessons he had taught me. true Dented Fender that I am, I was like, no, God, no, please. If you'd called me in my 20s when I was in the ministry, that would have been great, but not. Are you crazy? I mean, my witness is broken. I mean, and he's like, that's exactly why
That's
I'm
why,
calling you,
yes.
because you get it. You get what it means to deeply,
Mm-hmm.
really struggle. And I have not shared, but the smallest of smidgens of what
Yes.
that struggle was on this interview. But trust me when I say they
Mm-hmm.
were doozies, and yet
Mm-hmm.
God rescued me and brought me to this
Mm-hmm.
great place. But that's why he called me. He said, because you get it. You get it in a way that somebody who hasn't gone through those things doesn't get
Yes.
and doesn't
And then you
understand.
have an authenticity that is attracting other people, because a lot of people can tell when somebody is just standing up and saying, you should,
Yeah.
when it hasn't applied to themselves, but they can tell that it's applied to you already and that you therefore are genuine.
I think so. I think it's like if you're single and you hear somebody who's been married for 30, 40 years preach to you about purity. It's not that you don't
Yes.
believe them, but you're kind of like,
Huh,
okay,
yeah,
when's the
yeah, it
last time
wasn't
you
so hard
actually
for
had
you.
to deal with that one, you know?
Yeah.
It's there's just something different talking to
Hmm.
somebody who gets what you're going through.
Tell us, what does your ministry look like?
So
You have
what
something to
ended
show
up
us?
becoming, sure, what it ended up becoming, I didn't know that it would start out to be a book. That just wasn't even in my radar. But as I began to try and synthesize these powerful lessons God taught me in a way that would be transferable and easy to understand, that anybody could use to take them from point A to point B, but that wouldn't be a fix it book. I don't believe you can fix anybody. And anybody who tells me, oh, do steps 1 through 5 and you'll be fine, I just don't trust, right? Life is
No,
never that simple.
no.
So I ended up writing this book. It's all principles, godly, simple principles that are actually very challenging and deep and profound. But when you use them, they begin to change your trajectory and change your vision and your hope and begin moving you forward again. So I ended
Mm-hmm.
up writing a book. It's my book called Using What's Broken to Boldly Shine.
Uh-huh.
Because I think that's what God does. He takes the broken pieces in our lives and transforms them into something miraculous, something that we can't even
Mm-hmm.
anticipate. And so then I came up with classes
Mm-hmm.
that are based with around the book, and
Yes.
I do workshops
Yes.
and coaching. So those are kinds of the things that I've ended up doing based on what I felt like God was calling me to do.
Can you tell us one or two of the principles? You said it's a book of principles, not how-to steps.
I always call it a guide as opposed to a map, right? Because
Okay.
a guide takes into account your individual scenery and the pace that you're traveling at and where you're at on your path.
Mm-hmm.
Because you and I are at different points on our path. We just are, because we're different people. So the principles are vision, learning how to establish not your own vision for yourself, but God's vision for you. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that's especially important when you feel like you had a God vision that got smashed, right? Because He
Mm-hmm.
will show up and give you something even more remarkable. That has certainly been my experience. And then I talk about connection. I think one of the most misunderstood pieces for so many Christians is how God sees us when we're struggling. I
Mm-hmm.
think we think God's mad at us, or He's like, well, shaking his finger, how did you get there? And He's ashamed of us, or we're just thinking, oh, I'm so horrible, there's no way God wants to be there for me. Instead of understanding God is just right there, His heart is breaking with us, and in the midst of that storm, He's the one holding up His hand saying, just look up, I'm right here. I promise you we can get through this together. So I talk about how to connect with God much more deeply and how God sees us in the
Mm-hmm.
midst of struggle, because God has a very compassionate heart. And I think we miss that sometimes. Then I go and I also talk about connection with others. I call them wise advisors, the wise advisors in your life, the people who will tell you true, even if you don't want to hear it. Do you know they're
Mm-hmm.
willing to
Mm-hmm.
tell you the hard things because they love you and you can receive it because you know they love you, and kind of how to cultivate those relationships, how to find them if you don't, and how
Mm-hmm.
to enrich them if you do have them. So I talk about connection with others as well. And then
Okay.
bravery.
Okay.
Bravery is all about digging into your past, your triggers, your issues, because you are the only person you have control over, right? I can't change you, but I can change me. I can't hold anybody else accountable for their actions, maybe my children. That's about it. And once they hit a certain age, even then all bets are off, right? But I can hold myself accountable for my own actions. And that's really all I have power over, is
Mm-hmm.
allowing God to show up in my life and change me. So bravery is all about doing that, figuring out what your triggers are,
Mm-hmm.
what blocks you, and how to move through. Then after bravery, I talk about intentionality, and that's sort of where you come up with an intentional plan, but with God. Instead of you saying, "Well, this is what I'm going to do," So for me, I had to figure out, how am I going to get enough money? What should I do for a career? How am I going to help my children through all of these things? I had to make very intentional steps, but I did it through prayer and with God, and it made all
Mm-hmm.
the difference. So we
Yes.
talk about that, what that looks like versus you just coming up with your own plan and running ahead and doing what you think is best and hitting yet another wall, right? Then we talk about consistency, which is all about developing godly habits that enrich that whole process.
Mm-hmm.
We talk about intentionality with others, which is a lot about how to heal broken relationships in your life if they're at all healable, and then boldly shine,
And then boldly
celebrating the
shine.
moments, marking the victories,
Uh-huh.
especially when they're small. You have a day, for example, where you're just low,
Mm-hmm.
or you're in a season where you're depressed all the time because your circumstances are overwhelming, and you get this hour window where you feel okay. So many times we forget to take
Mm-hmm.
that hour window and say, "Thank you, God.
Thank you,
I had an
Lord.
hour
Yes.
today that was good." You know, and then the next day we forget we even had it. And so it's learning to mark those little
Mm-hmm.
victories, because over time those build to one big victory and one big changed life. But it's a progression over time.
Well, I am very happy to have heard about your life, your changed life, your ministry, and it's called the Dented Fender dot
TheDentedFender.com.
the
So if you just go to
dentedfender.com.
www.thedentedfender.com, that's where my blog is,
Okay.
actually. And then my blog always has a link to my website where there's my book and more
Mm-hmm.
information. So, but
Very
yeah,
good. Well, Barb, it's been so wonderful having you on the show, and I'm praying that the Lord will bless your ministry, bless your children, your own life, that you'll be a blessing to others in ways even that you cannot imagine at this point. Thank you so much.
thank you, Katie. Thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for joining us again on Why We Are Christians. Until next time, so long.